Sudanese citizens, it is with a deep sense of trepidation that I find myself today from the perspective of both a political and moral responsibility addressing you. We have all been watching with a sense of horror and apprehension how our beloved South Sudan continues to inexorably descend into the pit of despair and oblivion. To begin with, there is no doubt that security is the bedrock of any state that purports to be a viable member of the global community of nations. The protection of lives is the single most sacrosanct duty of the state. This is simply because personal safety is the only need that citizens, even in a neglected state such as the Republic of South Sudan, cannot provide by themselves. Of course, once citizens are left to fend for themselves in terms of protecting their lives and property, the state becomes anarchic and unviable. Since its formal independence as a sovereign state in July 2011, South Sudan has continued to grapple with multiple crises that it has not only totally failed to at least ameliorate, but only allowed to fester and worsen. The insecurity manifests itself in different forms. The Juba regime has lost the necessary political legitimacy that should underpin it, and this reality, coupled with incompetence and the determination to run both the SPLM and the government in a purely dictatorial fashion, have triggered political violence and insecurity. The government has dismally failed in discharging its duty to provide security. Consequently, both inter- and intra-communal violence, not to mention political violence, continue to needlessly claim many precious lives. Instead of addressing the serious security concerns facing the country by, among other things, starting with the adoption of mitigation measures, such as the effective disarmament of the civil population, the Juba regime remains content with half-hearted disarmament efforts that are notably starved of the necessary resources to render them productive. In fact, past attempts to disarm the civil population have foundered, primarily because the military units tasked with the disarmament exercise have not been well equipped with the armaments and other logistics needed for a successful disarmament mission. It is sad to note that many SSPDF soldiers have lost their lives in such ill-conceived disarmament campaigns because more often than not, they find themselves outnumbered and outgunned by the very armed civilians they have been sent to disarm. Current practice is that once the regime finishes with helping itself to whatever public resources it gets its hands on, it will usually employ whatever is left over, not for the protection of the people and territory of South Sudan, but rather for ensuring its own survival. The disregard for preservation of human life by the regime is so callous that the president himself has been on record on several occasions in the past saying that he was so sick and tired of the internecine killings among the population that he would not mind allowing people to butcher themselves, intervening only if and when the defeated party fled to him for protection. This means that even on an issue so critical as security, the regime's policy is reactive rather than proactive. Fellow citizens, during the protracted and bitter civil war that we waged for over 2 decades, we always harbored the hopes that one day the bountiful natural resources we have been endowed with, and especially our oil wealth, would be applied to fueling an agro-industrial surge to deliver socioeconomic prosperity. Unfortunately, none of that has come to pass. On the contrary, the tiny political elite that surrounds the president have diverted the proceeds of oil sales to their private personal accounts. This is being done through the allocation of highly inflated infrastructure development contracts especially road construction contracts, in exchange for crude oil cargoes. This results in huge financial resources being siphoned off and the economy deprived of the critical funds required to provide basic social services such as health and education. This has meant that we can neither develop human capital nor utilize the country's vast agricultural potential to diversify the economy away from excessive reliance on oil. And because South Sudan is not providing basic services, the task of treating our sick and educating our children has fallen to the benevolence of the international humanitarian community. This fact, coupled with the state's failure to diversify the economy of a potentially wealthy state, has plunged us into chronic self-inflicted poverty and misery. The economic situation is further compounded by the inability of government to consistently pay public sector wages. Without the infusion of cash into the economy, through, among others, salary payments, there is feeble demand. And without demand, the economy falters and widespread poverty becomes inescapable. And because our plight is our own making, we have not attracted much in the way of international sympathy. Instead, the international community is gradually starting to turn its back on South Sudan. They are dismayed by the fact that South Sudan continues to avoid funding legitimate obligations that are perfectly within its financial capability, preferring instead to shift that burden onto the shoulders of the international community. Our resources may still be modest, but to think that we can just steal and squander them, hoping that others would step in to compensate for the losses and foot the entire bill for running the state, is scandalous, to say the least. Who would have thought that a country with so much oil wealth relative to its population, not to mention its agricultural promise, livestock wealth, mineral and tourism potential, would be languishing in abject poverty and teetering on the brink of implosion? Instead of engaging in the systematic plunder of the country's hydrocarbon-generated wealth, our government should have been continuously reinvesting some of the oil proceeds to produce more crude, add value, and thus generate even more wealth from oil. Oil produces money. That in turn translates into more oil, which again brings in more money, and the positive cycle goes on. This is not rocket science, and it is precisely the formula that other oil-producing countries have employed to create sovereign wealth funds that in times of need they use as a buffer against economic shocks, thereby minimizing disruption of their economic development programs. Fellow citizens, the root cause of all our country's ills is political. Failure to appropriately manage political governance is where all our problems stem from. The right to govern should always be founded on the popular will of the citizenry as manifested in free and fair periodic elections. On account of the fact that no elections have been conducted since South Sudan became a sovereign independent state in July 2011, the current regime has no claim to legitimacy. The legitimacy imparted to the regime by the 2010 pre-independence elections lapsed a long time ago, and the planned 2015 polls that could have given it a fresh mandate never materialized. Even the semblance of legitimacy that could be argued was bestowed upon the regime by the 2018 revitalized agreement on the resolution of the conflict in South Sudan, the RRCs, is now gone after the agreement's demise and Juba's subsequent about turn on the Tumaini initiative. The current regime is therefore illegitimate, and hence there is full justification for its removal should it persist with blocking the transition to a new political dispensation from running its course. All attempts to have free and fair elections that would confer legitimacy on its winners have been frustrated by the repeated extensions of the transitional period ushered in by the RRCs. Neither of the agreement's principal signatories, namely the SPLM-IG and the SPLM-IO, appears particularly keen on steering it to its logical conclusion, which is to conduct free and fair elections leading to a new political order. Meanwhile, the leadership of the SPLM-IG is determined to avoid implementing the RRCs in full because it dreads the prospect of losing power if elections were to be held. The SPLM-IO, for its part, and for reasons only best known to them, have unwittingly played into the hands of the SPLM-IG by insisting on the implementation of the security arrangements in a fashion that defeats the very purpose of forming a single unified national army, a key pillar of the agreement. The forces that the SPLM-IO has made available for integration into the national unified force envisaged by the RRCs have a disproportionately large number of high-ranking officers compared to the overall size of the force itself. This directly violates the universal principle and practice that the number of commissioned officers that command troops in any military formation should correspond to the size of the military formation itself. So, meanwhile, the SPLM-IG has no intention whatsoever of implementing the RRCs, despite the frequent utterances of reassurance to the contrary by its spokespersons. The SPLM-IO itself has effectively blocked the implementation of the security arrangements component of the RRCs, thereby also contributing to undermining its implementation. The implementation of the provisions of the RRCs is the pathway to elections, and so non-implementation simply means a rejection, either deliberately or unintentionally, of the elections. It is now abundantly clear that the sole reason the Juba regime continues to repeatedly extend the transitional period is to avoid elections at any cost. All other reasons being given for the delays in steering the transition period and bringing it to a close amount to nothing more than mere pretext to avoid its culmination point, namely the elections. However, the imperative of holding free and fair elections in South Sudan sooner rather than later is an existential matter. For the state to ultimately survive, it cannot avoid a peaceful transfer of power through fair and free democratic elections. There are only two avenues to political power: the peaceful route through the will of the electorate as expressed through free, fair and credible polls, or the violent route via attempts to remove and replace the government by force. And the latter path can only be a last resort in the event that the government itself seeks to retain power through brute force. The regime should know by now that recourse to violence in the pursuit of power can only be averted by fully opening up civil and political space that affords all citizens the right to freely express their views, politically organize within the boundaries of what the Constitution and the law permit, and exercise their fundamental political right to vie without undue obstacles for any leadership positions in the land that they seek. Fellow citizens, the failure of political governance that I've already alluded to is the consequence of the lack of a guiding vision. This does not in any way imply that the SPLM as the ruling party has no vision. Far from it. The movement has always, and from its inception, had a vision. With the demise of the SPLM's founding leader, Dr. John Garang de Mabur, that vision was simply discarded. Shortly before Dr. Garang's passing, he and his successor at the helm of the SPLM, our current president, became embroiled in acrimonious disagreements that threatened to scuttle the Naivasha peace process, which thankfully eventually led to the 2005 comprehensive peace agreement with Khartoum. The tragedy is that our president did not distinguish between his predecessor as an individual that he intensely came to dislike over the years and the vision that belongs to all of us, himself included. And so he tossed out the proverbial baby with the bathwater without even replacing that baby with anything tangible. As a result, our movement, the SPLM, and by extension the South Sudanese state that the SPLM runs, at least theoretically, continues to drift rudderless without any direction. One of the clearest attestations to the emergence of a leadership vacuum following the death of Dr. John Garang the Mabior comes in the form of South Sudan's failure to craft appropriate policies to govern the oil sector, which is the lifeblood of its economy. As a landlocked country with oil resources that are by no means insignificant, even a political novice, if installed as president in Juba, would have put in place safeguards against political risks by diversifying outlets to the sea for our oil exports and building at least an oil refinery. And of course, none of that happened. And when war broke out in 2023 in neighboring Sudan, through which our oil flows on its way to export markets, the flow of crude was disrupted, and consequently, income from the Dar blend oil dried up, with disastrous repercussions for an economy already in the intensive care unit. On another related matter, the leadership also appears to have totally forgotten the long-standing SPLM pledge to maximize oil production so as to generate resources to fuel agriculture as the mainstay of our country's economy and the ultimate source of its prosperity. With the bulk of annual budgetary allocations going to the presidency and defense respectively, the agricultural sector, like the rest, are left to feed on crumbs. And that explains why our country, that is regarded as one of the region's potential breadbaskets, is unable to even feed its own population. Fellow citizens, the vision of the SPLM that we need to reclaim entails a two-phase struggle. Phase one is the liberation phase, and that, thanks to the massive sacrifices of our people over the years, was achieved by the proclamation of our independent state in 2011. The second and final phase of our struggle involves addressing the twin tasks of state building and national formation. State building to transform our fledgling country into a modern, economically prosperous, and socially harmonious entity. And national formation to fuse the different socio-cultural strands of our ethnically diverse society into a single South Sudanese identity and commonality. That is the mission that was awaiting the SPLM post-independence. Unfortunately, the SPLM found itself being systematically dismantled, ironically, by some of its own founders. Its vision and programs have been jettisoned, leaving it with no political compass. The chairperson of the SPLM has arbitrarily and single-handedly dismantled the leadership hierarchy of the movement in flagrant contravention of the Constitution, rules, and procedures. Its historical leaders have been humiliated and unceremoniously dumped out of the party leadership. Lifelong SPLM cadres have been facing political persecution to the extent that many of them have been replaced by people who even at one point were sworn enemies of the SPLM. It is a known fact that when most cadres joined the SPLM in its formative years and went on to become commissioned SPLA officers, gallantly commanding battles during our long liberation struggle, they essentially did so as a political decision. They flocked to the ranks of the SPLM, SPLA for a political cause. They did not do that for the sake of becoming soldiers per se. The military for them was only an instrument to achieve liberation. Therefore, it was expected that once they ended their service in the South Sudan People's Defense Force, the SSPDF, and retired, they would be given the opportunity as a matter of priority to continue formally serving as SPLM cadres in SPLM structures such as the General Secretariat and other organs. Other retirees who have acquired appropriate qualifications over the years could have been used to staff our foreign service and other government agencies in line with their qualifications and skills. Unfortunately, these cadres have been brushed aside and left to fend for themselves. This is how their sacrifices have been rewarded. And because these cadres are not in power, there is no one left to uphold the SPLM vision and implement it. No wonder then that South Sudan embraced statehood in 2011 without a clear governance roadmap, and hence the failure. Fellow citizens, our government continues to behave and act in a manner which suggests that it is totally oblivious to the universal principle of the supremacy of the rule of law. All civilized states are governed by this cardinal principle. In South Sudan, the absence of the rule of law has led to violation of fundamental human rights and the arbitrary deprivation of citizens of their lives and liberties. Decisions restructuring the SPLM, as well as resolutions effecting appointments and dismissals in its leadership structures, are made in flagrant violation of its own constitution, rules, and procedures. At the level of the government, the president just takes decisions on a whim, ignoring altogether the provisions of the RCs and the Constitution, which expressly render such decisions illegal. This situation is simply untenable, and it only exacerbates the government's crisis of legitimacy. Since, as stated earlier, the regime's mandate technically lapsed in 2015, the promise of elections embedded in the 2018 RRCs is what imparts it with the veneer of legitimacy. However, since the RRCs has now been practically ripped apart and the Tumaini process abandoned, the only course of action is to go back to the drawing board and use the spirit of the RRCs and Tumaini to craft new arrangements to save the country. All the provisions of the RRCs are undoubtedly essential and in an ideal world ought to be implemented in full. However, and strictly for the purpose of jump-starting the stalled transition process, only three elements are indispensable at this stage. These elements of the RRCs should form the centerpiece of a new strategy for the attainment of durable peace and the institution of a democratic, people-centered governance paradigm. Therefore, the Juba regime should be made to expeditiously implement them. These are: 1. The immediate opening up of civic and political space to permit free speech, freedom of association and assembly, in keeping with the tenets of a democratic multi-party system. For as long as people do not engage in incitement to violence, they should not be detained, intimidated, or harassed for simply expressing legitimate views that criticize the government's performance or just happen to be at variance with the position of the government. 2. Expediting the process of writing a permanent constitution that encapsulates the sovereign will and consensus of the people on how best they would want their country and society to be run. 3. To allow the widest possible participation in the constitution-making exercise Some of its critical phases should be conducted abroad to ensure that participants can freely express their views without fear of persecution. It is my humble suggestion that a neighboring state would be an ideal host for the Constitutional Conference. 4. The conduct of genuinely free and fair elections that fulfill the following benchmarks. A. The provision of a level playing field that permits all aspirants to freely contest elections. B. Allowing candidates to freely campaign for votes by holding rallies and carrying out any other such activities aimed at winning support. And C. Refraining from unduly influencing the outcome of the polls by detaining or arresting opposition candidates. Fellow citizens, in relation to the issue of elections, it must be stated that the prospect of the current regime holding free and fair elections without being pressured into doing so is sheer fantasy. The Juba regime is trapped in a dilemma. It cannot hold free and fair elections for fear, and justifiably so, that it would lose them and forfeit power. On the other hand, it could of course organize and win rigged elections, but then the power so acquired would lack legitimacy. And it goes without saying that an illegitimate government will continue facing armed resistance and peace will remain elusive. The scenario I have just outlined is the simple reason why elections under the current regime will never happen, and why the masses of our people need to mobilize and take action to force the regime into holding genuinely free and fair elections. Time is of the essence. South Sudan is in the grip of total paralysis and sits on a time bomb that is inexorably ticking away to its utter destruction. The only way to defuse this bomb is to supplant the current regime with a government chosen through the free will of the South Sudanese electorate. We must note the fact that the writing of a new constitution, followed by free and fair elections, are the only indispensable prerequisites to avoid state collapse, and should therefore be the only focus of our attention and energies. These two processes must be fast-tracked. Meanwhile, the implementation of other provisions of the RRCs, important as they are, should be deferred for action by the post-election government. In a nutshell, allow me to reiterate the following. The SPLM is comatose, and our state is on the brink of collapse. To rectify the situation, a series of measures are required. First, action must be taken to revive and restore the SPLM to its original trajectory from which it has veered off. Second, steps must be taken to institute democratic rule. Third, the country's economic resources must be appropriately utilized for service delivery. And finally, the supremacy of the rule of law must be upheld and citizens' lives safeguarded. Dear fellow citizens, in order to promote the attainment of these overarching goals, as well as exert pressure on the regime to deliver on the specific and immediate objectives of opening up civil and political space, initiating the promulgation of a permanent constitution, and the holding of free and fair elections, I have hereby resolved to temporarily freeze my membership of the SPLM till it is once again fit for purpose, and to declare the launch of the South Sudan Salvation Movement, the SSSM, as a temporary vehicle for waging the struggle to wrest control of the SPLM out of the hands of those who have hijacked and held it captive for so long. The SSSM is an organization that shall operate under the umbrella of the United People's Alliance, of which it shall be a constituent member, as it acts in concert with other opposition, political, and armed groups for the realization of the aforementioned aims and objectives. The SSSM is not an end in itself. It is not intended to replace the SPLM. It is being conceived simply as a device to steer fundamental reforms within the SPLM and bring about its total renaissance. It will merely be a catalyst for correcting the course of a movement that has gone astray. And I therefore call upon all SPLM members who wish to save their movement to immediately join the SSSM and by extension, the United People's Alliance, the UPA. Fellow citizens, I urge full mobilization so as to start waging our multi-pronged campaign of the second liberation in much the same way the masses of our people did between 1983 and 2011 to consummate the first liberation struggle and achieve independence. I urge all the masses of our people in the urban centers and the rural areas to rise up and reclaim their power that the regime has usurped. I encourage all SPLM rank and file, patriotic elements of the SSPDF and the National Security Service, the NSS, other organized forces, and all other patriotic and peace-loving citizens to rise up in mass action to reclaim our country by creating the conditions necessary to compel the Juba regime to write a new constitution and conduct free and fair multi-party elections before the end of 2026. We must act now, and I call for an uprising of the masses of our people so that we can accelerate the process of reorienting our country in the direction of the state we have long aspired to, a multinational state of peace, justice, and prosperity for all. And in order to achieve concerted mass popular action, I exhort patriotic elements within the SSPDF and other organized forces not to quell any popular protest action in order to do so, but instead to act to protect it. Our communities must stop shedding each other's blood in senseless clashes. They should instead come together and redirect their campaign against the regime and the opportunistic politicians that have used and failed them. It is the dysfunctional nature of our state that pits our communities against one another, because we have all now been obliged, in the absence of a state capable of protecting lives and property and dispensing justice, to take the protection of our lives and possessions into our own hands. Fellow citizens, as I make this statement, I am certain some of you will be quick to accuse me of hypocrisy and disingenuousness, and I can understand that. After all, I've been part of the Juba political setup since its inauguration in October 2005, soon after the conclusion of the Comprehensive Peace Agreement, the CPA. So some may find it baffling to hear me making such a stinging critique of the regime. Those who do not know me may be justified if they characterize my remarks as dishonest and self-seeking. However, anyone who is familiar with my service in the SPLM, starting from the early days of the liberation struggle in the bush and up to date, understands that I have always been consistent in my convictions. When it became clear to me as early as mid-2006 that our movement had started deviating from its course, I resigned my post as Minister of Regional Cooperation in the then government of Southern Sudan and left the country. And ever since my return to government in the late 2008 and up to the present, I've been clinging to the hope that our chairman and president would return to the fold of the SPLM, re-embrace his comrades, and work hand in hand with them to run the country in accordance with the vision, principles, and programs of the movement. It is now crystal clear that the dream of saving the SPLM under the incumbent leadership will never be fulfilled. And it is time for us, the cadres of the SPLM that still believe in it, to stand up and be counted. Even as some of you may disapprove of my decision, I know that the majority among you have likely been disappointed by the fact that a senior SPLM leader, such as myself, has remained mute all along. Meanwhile, the situation of South Sudan continues to deteriorate steadily. I know that as a member of the ruling elite, I cannot altogether escape blame for the mess in which we find ourselves today. But I now give you my solemn pledge that not only will I speak out, but perhaps more importantly, I will also act to contribute to bringing about the desired change. Fellow citizens, I finally wish to conclude with a message to our neighbors in the region. We deeply value the support and solidarity we have enjoyed from some of you over the years in the course of our bitter and long struggle. We further commend you for your continued contribution to the development of South Sudan, whether from the perspective of promoting mutually beneficial bilateral relationships or in the context of collective regional integration efforts. However, even as we applaud the positive role you have played in our evolution, we would also like to urge you to allow us space to exercise our sovereign right to freely chart our own policies, elect our own leaders, and craft our political destiny without undue hindrance. God bless South Sudan. God bless you all. I am Nhial Deng, member of the SPLM Political Bureau and member of the National Transition Legislative Assembly of South Sudan. Thank you.